"Find this woman before Christmas," Daniel Brooks said quietly as he placed the small gold ring beneath the lamp on his office desk. The jeweler standing across from him frowned in confusion. "Sir, we buy hundreds of rings every month." Daniel never looked up. His eyes stayed fixed on the tiny engraving inside the band. "Forever, no matter how hard life gets." For a moment, the entire room went silent except for the rain tapping against the windows 30 floors above Manhattan. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening, as if the ring carried a memory he had spent years trying to bury. "I don't care what it costs," he said. "Just find her." 3 months earlier, Emily Carter stood outside a pawn shop on a freezing Thursday evening, pulling her thin gray coat tighter around herself, while her 2 children waited beside her under the flickering neon sign. 8-year-old Sophie held her little brother Liam's hand as cold wind swept through the empty parking lot. Liam coughed into his sleeve again, his small shoulders shaking from the cold. Emily looked down at the envelope in her hand. Inside was the final notice from the electric company. 48 hours. That was all they had left before the power would be shut off in their apartment. Her stomach twisted when she remembered there was barely half a gallon of milk left in the fridge. Sophie tried to smile anyway. "Mom, I'm not really hungry." Emily forced a smile back, but mothers always knew when their children lied to protect them. She opened her purse slowly and stared at the wedding ring resting at the bottom beside a few coins and an old grocery receipt. It was the last thing she had from her marriage. The last proof that at one point in her life, somebody had promised she would never struggle alone. Her fingers trembled as she slipped the ring onto her palm one final time. For a second, she almost put it back. Then Liam coughed again. That decided everything. Inside the pawn shop, the smell of dust and old metal filled the air. A man behind the counter looked up from a stack of papers as the bell above the door rang softly. Daniel Brooks wore no expensive suit that day. No watch. No sign that he owned one of the largest luxury jewelry companies in New York. To Emily, he looked like an ordinary employee working late. Daniel noticed the children first. Sophie's worn sneakers. Liam's red cheeks from the cold. Then he noticed Emily placing the wedding ring carefully onto the counter, like it might break if she let go too quickly. "How much are you asking for?" he asked gently. Emily swallowed hard before answering. $12. Daniel looked up immediately. "Only 12. She nodded, embarrassed. "It's enough for groceries and my son's medicine tonight." Daniel picked up the ring carefully. The gold was scratched and faded, but the engraving inside caught his attention instantly. "Forever, no matter how hard life gets." The color drained from his face. Emily noticed his expression and quickly shook her head. "I know it's probably not worth much." Daniel stared at the engraving for several long seconds without speaking. Somewhere deep in his memory, a voice he had not heard in over 20 years suddenly echoed again. And in that moment, Emily Carter had no idea that selling that $12 ring was about to change both of their lives forever. Emily walked out of the pawn shop holding the small paper bag of groceries against her chest like it was something precious. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, peanut butter, canned soup, and Liam's inhaler medicine wrapped carefully in a pharmacy bag. $12 did not go far in New York City, but somehow she always found a way to stretch every penny a little longer. Snow had started falling harder by the time they reached the bus stop. Sophie leaned her head against Emily's arm while Liam sat quietly beside them, exhausted from coughing. Emily glanced at the nearly empty street and silently prayed the heater inside their apartment building would still be working tonight. Their apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an old brick building in Queens where the hallway lights flickered constantly and the pipes rattled every winter. When Emily opened the front door, cold air greeted them immediately. The apartment felt almost as freezing inside as it did outside. She quickly set the groceries down and turned the oven on halfway, leaving the small oven door cracked open to warm the kitchen. Sophie sat at the tiny table doing homework beneath a weak yellow light, while Liam curled up under a blanket on the couch. Emily moved quietly around the apartment, pretending not to notice how little food remained. Parents became experts at pretending. Pretending they were not tired. Pretending they were not scared. Pretending everything would somehow be okay. After the children fell asleep that night, Emily opened the kitchen drawer and pulled out a stack of unpaid bills secured with a rubber band. Rent, electric, medical bills from Liam's asthma treatments. She closed her eyes for a moment when she saw the overdue stamp across the top of another envelope. 3 years earlier, her life had looked completely different. Back then, she and her husband Jason had rented a small house in New Jersey. They had backyard barbecues during the summer and movie nights every Friday. Jason used to kiss her forehead every morning before work and tell her everything would work out. But after the construction company he worked for shut down, things slowly changed. Stress became arguments. Arguments became silence. And one day, Jason packed a suitcase and left, promising he would come back after finding work in another state. At first he called every week, then every month. Eventually the calls stopped completely. Emily never filed for divorce. Part of her had spent years believing he might still walk through the door one day apologizing for all of it. That was why selling the ring hurt more than losing the money ever could. It was not just jewelry. It was the burial of the last hope she had been carrying for years. The next morning, Emily woke before sunrise for her shift at a diner 8 blocks away. She moved carefully so she would not wake the children. Before leaving, she kissed Liam's forehead and tucked Sophie's blanket around her shoulders. On the kitchen counter, she left 2 slices of toast covered with peanut butter beside a handwritten note that read, "Be good for each other. I love you both more than anything." Outside, freezing wind swept through the streets as Emily hurried toward the bus. Stop wearing shoes with tiny cracks near the soles. Across town, Daniel Brooks sat alone in his penthouse office staring once again at the wedding ring beneath the desk lamp. He had not slept much since the night Emily walked into the pawn shop. Something about that engraving refused to leave his mind. He slowly opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph of his mother holding his hand outside a rundown apartment building almost 30 years earlier. Around her finger was a wedding ring identical to Emily's. Daniel stared at the photo for a long moment before quietly whispering words he had not said aloud in decades. "Mom, who was she?" For the next several days, Daniel could not stop thinking about Emily Carter. He tried distracting himself with meetings, investors, and endless phone calls from executives across the country. But every time the room became quiet, his mind drifted back to the exhausted woman standing inside that pawn shop asking for only $12. Most people negotiated for more money. Most people demanded sympathy. Emily had done neither. She had simply asked for enough to survive one more night. Late Monday afternoon, Daniel walked into the flagship Brooks jewelry showroom on 5th Avenue while employees rushed around preparing for a private event. Crystal chandeliers glowed above rows of diamonds worth more than most people earned in years. Customers laughed softly while sipping champagne near glass displays lined with engagement rings. Daniel paused near the entrance, suddenly remembering how cold Emily's hands had looked when she placed her wedding ring on the counter. The difference between these worlds made his chest feel heavy. "Mr. Brooks?" his assistant Rachel asked carefully as she approached holding a tablet. "The investors from Chicago are waiting upstairs." Daniel nodded absently, but before stepping into the elevator, he asked, "Can you find an address for someone?" Rachel looked surprised. "Of course." Daniel handed her a small note with Emily's name written across it. "Emily Carter, Queens." Rachel hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I will see what I can do." That evening, Emily stood behind the counter at the diner refilling coffee cups while exhausted commuters drifted in from the freezing rain outside. Her feet hurt so badly she could barely feel her toes anymore, but she forced herself to smile every time a customer looked up. Tips had been terrible all week. One man left 75 cents after sitting at her table for nearly an hour. Another complained the soup was not hot enough even after she brought him a second bowl. By 8 o'clock, Emily finally checked her phone during a quiet moment near the kitchen. Her heart dropped immediately. 3 missed calls from Liam's school nurse. Emily hurried to the back hallway and called the number with trembling hands. "Miss Carter," the nurse said gently. "Liam had trouble breathing during recess today. He is okay now, but I really think he should see a specialist soon." Emily closed her eyes. She already knew what came next. More appointments. More medicine. More bills she could not afford. "Thank you," she whispered quietly before hanging up. When her shift ended after 10 o'clock, snow covered the sidewalks again. Emily pulled her coat tighter while walking home through the freezing wind, carrying leftover diner rolls wrapped in napkins for the children. She hated bringing leftovers home, but Sophie always smiled like it was a feast. Upstairs in their apartment building, the hallway smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old paint. As Emily climbed the stairs, she noticed an envelope taped to her apartment door. Final warning. Rent overdue. Her stomach sank instantly. She quickly removed the notice before the children could see it. Inside the apartment, Sophie sat asleep at the kitchen table beside unfinished homework while Liam rested on the couch with his inhaler beside him. Emily stood there silently for a moment watching them breathe. Everything she did was for these two children. Every sacrifice, every humiliation, every sleepless night. She quietly covered Sophie with a blanket before opening the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, a few eggs, butter, nothing else. Emily leaned against the counter and rubbed her tired eyes, trying not to cry where the children might wake up and hear her. At that exact moment across the city, Rachel entered Daniel's office carrying a thin folder. "I found her," she said softly. Daniel looked up immediately. Rachel placed the file on his desk. Single mother. 2 children. Works at a diner in Queens. Daniel slowly opened the folder and stared at the small photograph clipped inside. Emily looked even more exhausted than he remembered. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he noticed something else in the report. An overdue medical bill for Liam Carter. Daniel's expression changed instantly. "Get me the hospital information," he said quietly. Rachel frowned in confusion. "Sir, what exactly are you planning to do?" Daniel looked back at the wedding ring resting beneath the lamp on his desk. "Something I should have done a very long time ago." The following morning, Emily woke to the sound of Liam coughing again in the next room. The weak winter sunlight barely slipped through the cracked blinds as she sat up quickly on the old pull-out couch she slept on every night. For one brief second, she forgot about the overdue rent notice sitting inside the kitchen drawer. Then reality returned all at once. Bills, work, food, medicine. Fear had become part of her morning routine now. She walked quietly into the kitchen and opened the cabinet above the sink. 1 box of macaroni, half a jar of peanut butter, 2 cans of soup. Emily stared at the shelves silently before taking a slow breath and forcing herself to smile as Sophie entered the room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Morning, Mom." Emily kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Good morning, sweetheart." Sophie looked toward the nearly empty counter and immediately understood. Children who grow up around struggle learn to notice things adults wish they would not. "I can eat lunch at school," Sophie said softly. "You do not have to pack me anything." Emily felt her chest tighten. No 10-year-old should already know how to sacrifice. "You are getting lunch either way," Emily replied gently, even though she had no idea what she would pack yet. Across the city, Daniel sat inside the back seat of a black SUV parked across the street from Emily's apartment building. Snow rested lightly along the sidewalks while people hurried past bundled in scarves and heavy coats. His driver glanced into the mirror. "Sir, are we waiting for someone?" Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the apartment entrance. "Just stay here." A few minutes later, Emily stepped outside holding Liam's hand while Sophie carried a faded pink backpack beside them. Daniel watched carefully as Emily knelt down to zip Liam's coat higher against the cold. Even from across the street, he could see how exhausted she looked. But he also noticed something else. She never stopped paying attention to the children. She adjusted Sophie's scarf, smoothed Liam's hair, smiled at them even when nobody smiled back at her. Daniel looked down at the wedding ring resting in his coat pocket. His mother used to do the exact same things. He remembered cold winters in Brooklyn when she skipped meals pretending she had already eaten at work. He remembered hearing her cry quietly behind the bathroom door after the rent collector left. Most of all, he remembered the day her wedding ring disappeared from her finger forever. Daniel had been only 11 years old. "We just need to make it through this month," his mother had whispered back then. She never did. The memory still followed him decades later. Emily and the children disappeared around the corner toward school, but Daniel remained seated in silence for another long moment. Finally, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Rachel," he said quietly when she answered. "I want every outstanding medical bill for Liam Carter paid today." There was a pause. "Anonymous?" she asked. "Completely." Daniel ended the call and leaned back against the seat, but something still felt unfinished. Helping financially was easy. Money solved problems quickly. But deep down, he knew this was not only about bills. It was about the loneliness he recognized in Emily's eyes. The kind of loneliness people carried when life disappointed them too many times in a row. Later that evening, Emily arrived home after another exhausting shift, and checked the mailbox downstairs before climbing the stairs. Mostly advertisements. One utility reminder. Then she froze. A plain, white envelope sat at the bottom addressed to her from Queen's Memorial Hospital. Emily's stomach tightened immediately as she opened it under the dim hallway light. Her eyes moved quickly across the page once, then twice. Balance paid in full. She blinked in confusion. There had to be some mistake. She turned the paper over searching for an explanation, but there was nothing else inside. No name, no note, no signature, just a $0 balance. Upstairs, Sophie opened the apartment door before Emily could find her keys. "Mom?" she asked nervously. "Are we okay?" Emily stared down at the paper in her trembling hands while cold air drifted through the hallway behind her. For the first time in months, she did not know what to say. Emily spent the next several days trying to understand who could have paid Liam's hospital bills, but no matter how many times she called the billing office, the answer stayed the same. Anonymous payment received in full. The woman on the phone sounded cheerful about it. Emily only felt unsettled. Good things did not usually happen to people like her without a reason attached. Still, for the first time in months, one crushing weight had disappeared from her shoulders. That Friday evening, Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room floor coloring while Liam quietly watched cartoons beneath a blanket. The apartment was still cold, but at least the electricity remained on. Emily stood at the stove stirring canned soup into a pot of noodles when Sophie suddenly looked up. "Mom." Emily smiled softly. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie hesitated. "Do you think maybe Dad sent the money?" The spoon stopped moving in Emily's hand. For a second, the room felt painfully quiet except for the television playing softly in the background. Emily forced herself to keep stirring. "I do not know," she answered carefully. Sophie lowered her eyes back to her coloring book, but Emily could tell she was trying not to look disappointed. Liam spoke next without taking his eyes off the television. "Maybe somebody is helping us because you are nice." Emily swallowed hard at those words. Children always saw things adults overlooked. Later that night, after the children fell asleep, Emily sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the unpaid rent notice again. Even with the hospital debt gone, she was still 2 months behind on rent. Her diner paycheck barely covered groceries and transportation. Winter was getting worse. She needed another job. The next morning, Emily walked nearly 12 blocks through freezing wind to apply for a housekeeping position at a downtown hotel. By the time she arrived, snow clung to the edges of her boots and her fingers had gone numb from the cold. The manager behind the desk barely glanced at her resume before shaking his head apologetically. "We already filled the position yesterday." Emily thanked him politely anyway, even though disappointment burned in her chest. Rejection had become another normal part of her life. On her way back toward the bus stop, she passed a bakery window filled with fresh cinnamon rolls and warm bread. Sophie loved cinnamon rolls. Emily checked her wallet. $4.30. She kept walking. Across town, Daniel sat inside a conference room filled with executives discussing expansion plans for a new luxury showroom in California. Voices blended together around him while charts flashed across giant screens. Profit margins, investments, market growth. Normally, Daniel controlled every detail of these meetings, but today his attention drifted constantly. Finally, one executive paused mid-presentation. Daniel looked up. "Sorry, continue." But even as the meeting resumed, his mind returned to the image of Emily walking home in the snow carrying grocery bags that barely weighed anything. 2 worlds inside the same city. One filled with luxury watches worth $50,000. The other struggling to afford bread. That evening, Rachel entered Daniel's office carrying another file. "I checked on the apartment situation," she said carefully. "They are threatening eviction if she misses another payment." Daniel looked out the window, overlooking Manhattan's glowing skyline. "How much does she owe?" Rachel told him the number. Daniel stared silently for several seconds before shaking his head slowly. It was less than the cost of the leather chairs sitting in his office. "Pay it," he said quietly. Rachel nodded, but hesitated again. "Sir, if you keep helping anonymously, eventually she is going to start asking questions." Daniel slipped the wedding ring from his pocket and rolled it gently between his fingers. "I know." Rachel studied him carefully. "Then why not just meet her?" Daniel looked down at the engraving inside the ring one more time before answering. "Because if I do this too soon, it becomes about me." Meanwhile, several miles away, Emily unlocked her apartment door after another exhausting shift and froze immediately. The lights were on. Warm air filled the apartment. And sitting on the kitchen table beside Sophie's homework was a fresh box of groceries she knew she could not afford. Emily stood frozen near the apartment door, staring at the groceries spread across the kitchen table. Bread, pasta, fresh fruit, cereal, milk, even a box of cinnamon rolls from the bakery she had passed earlier that morning. For a moment, she honestly thought she might be dreaming. Sophie looked up from the table with wide eyes. "Mom, somebody knocked earlier and left all this outside the door." Emily slowly stepped closer. There were no receipts, no notes, no name anywhere. Liam walked into the kitchen rubbing his sleepy eyes and immediately smiled when he saw the cereal boxes. "Are those for us?" Emily forced herself to smile back, even though confusion and emotion tightened her chest. "I guess they are." Sophie lowered her voice carefully. "Do you think it is the same person who paid the hospital bills?" Emily did not answer right away. She picked up the cinnamon rolls and stared at them silently. Whoever this person was, they somehow knew exactly what her children liked. That thought unsettled her more than anything else. Across town, Daniel sat inside the back corner booth of a quiet restaurant overlooking Central Park. Rachel sat across from him reviewing paperwork while snow drifted softly outside the windows. "The landlord confirmed the rent payment cleared this morning," she said, "and the grocery delivery was successful." Daniel nodded absently while staring down into his untouched coffee. How did she react? Rachel gave him a small smile. Confused, grateful, suspicious. Daniel almost smiled at that last word. "Good." Rachel leaned back slightly. "You still have not explained why this matters so much to you." Daniel remained quiet for several seconds before finally speaking. "When I was 10 years old, my mother lost our apartment 3 days before Christmas." Rachel listened silently. Daniel rarely talked about his childhood. "A stranger paid our rent anonymously," he continued quietly. "We never found out who it was." Rachel frowned softly. "So this is about repaying a debt?" Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. It is about understanding why somebody would care enough to help complete strangers." Meanwhile, Emily spent the next week waiting for another mysterious surprise to appear at her door, but nothing happened. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as survival could feel. She worked double shifts at the diner while Sophie helped Liam with homework after school. The grocery boxes slowly emptied again. Bills continued arriving in the mailbox. One freezing Thursday night, Emily's manager pulled her aside near the kitchen. "I need somebody to cover the morning shift tomorrow, too." Emily looked exhausted already. "That would make 14 hours straight." "I know," the manager replied apologetically. "But Tina quit this morning, and we are short-staffed." Emily glanced toward the clock. More hours meant more money. She could not afford to say no. "Okay," she whispered. By midnight, her feet burned with pain as she wiped down empty tables after the diner finally closed. Outside, freezing rain covered the streets in ice. Emily stepped carefully toward the bus stop, holding her coat tightly around herself when her phone suddenly rang. Her stomach dropped immediately when she saw Sophie's name. "Mom." Sophie's voice sounded shaky. "Liam cannot stop coughing." Emily's heart started racing. "Did you use the inhaler?" "Yes, but he still says his chest hurts." Emily immediately turned around, searching desperately for a taxi in the empty street. "I am coming home right now." 20 minutes later, she burst through the apartment door out of breath. Liam sat curled beneath blankets, struggling to breathe evenly while Sophie rubbed his back, trying to comfort him. Emily knelt beside the couch and gently touched Liam's forehead. He felt warm, too warm. Fear spread through her instantly. She reached for her phone to call a doctor before suddenly stopping. The specialist appointment she had postponed because of money flashed through her mind again. She had hoped the medication alone would help long enough until she could save enough for another visit. But looking at Liam now, she realized hope was no longer enough. Across the city, Daniel stood alone inside his penthouse apartment, staring out at the snow-covered skyline when his phone buzzed softly beside him. Rachel's message was short. "Liam Carter. Emergency pediatric appointment scheduled tomorrow morning." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment after reading it. Then he looked down once more at the wedding ring resting in his hand and quietly whispered, "I will not let this family fall apart too." The next morning, Emily sat beside Liam inside a crowded pediatric clinic while Sophie quietly read a worn library book in the corner chair nearby. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, and every few minutes another exhausted parent walked through the doors carrying a coughing child. Emily kept checking the clock on the wall because every minute away from work meant less money on her next paycheck. Liam leaned against her shoulder looking pale and tired. "Mom," he whispered softly. "Are doctors expensive?" Emily forced a gentle smile and brushed his hair back carefully. "Do not worry about that, sweetheart." But inside, worry was all she could think about. When the nurse finally called Liam's name, Emily followed her nervously down the hallway, expecting another impossible bill she would somehow need to survive. Instead, after the examination ended, the doctor entered holding Liam's chart with a surprisingly calm expression. "His asthma has been getting worse because of the cold weather and stress," the doctor explained. "But we can help stabilize it with better treatment." Emily nodded anxiously. "How much will it cost?" The doctor looked briefly confused as she checked the file again. "Your coverage was already approved this morning." Emily blinked. "Approved by who?" "It says here a private foundation covered the expenses." Emily stared silently at the doctor, her chest tightening again with the same strange mixture of relief and fear. Somebody was watching over them. Somebody with money. Somebody who somehow always appeared right before things collapsed completely. On the other side of Manhattan, Daniel sat inside his office reviewing paperwork when Rachel entered carrying another folder. "There is something else you should know," she said carefully. Daniel looked up immediately. Rachel handed him several pages clipped together. "I did more research on Emily's husband." Daniel's expression darkened slightly as he opened the file. Jason Carter officially disappeared almost 3 years ago. No child support. No contact. No forwarding address. Daniel stared silently at the information. Rachel lowered her voice. "She has been doing this alone the entire time." Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair, absorbing the weight of that sentence. Doing this alone. Somehow those words hit him harder than anything else. He remembered his own mother working late-night cleaning jobs while neighbors babysat him because she could not afford daycare. He remembered hearing adults whisper words like struggling and behind on rent and eviction. But more than anything, he remembered how tired his mother always looked. The same exhaustion lived in Emily's eyes now. Rachel studied Daniel carefully. "You cannot keep hiding forever." Daniel looked down at the wedding ring resting beside the papers on his desk. "I know. Then what are you waiting for?" Daniel remained quiet for several long seconds before answering honestly. "I am afraid if I step into their lives now, I might change something fragile that is keeping them strong." That evening, Emily returned home with Liam's medicine bag resting carefully in her purse. Snow drifted softly outside the apartment windows while Sophie helped Liam decorate paper snowflakes at the kitchen table. For the first time in weeks, Liam seemed calmer, healthier. Emily watched them quietly while hanging her coat near the door. Then she noticed another envelope sitting on the table. Her stomach tightened immediately. She slowly picked it up expecting another overdue bill. Instead, she found a handwritten card inside. No signature, no address. Just one sentence written neatly across the center. "Good people deserve another chance to breathe." Emily stared at the message for a long moment. Her eyes slowly filled with tears she had spent months trying to hold back. Nobody had spoken kindly to her in a very long time. Not without wanting something in return. Sophie noticed her expression immediately. "Mom." Emily quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile. "I am okay." But later that night, after the children fell asleep, Emily sat alone beside the dark apartment window holding the note in trembling hands. Outside, Christmas lights glowed softly across nearby buildings while snow covered the streets below. Emily looked up toward the silent city skyline and whispered quietly into the empty room, "Who are you?" Several miles away, Daniel stood beside his own window overlooking Manhattan while the exact same snowfall covered the city between them. His phone buzzed softly with a calendar reminder. December 23rd. 2 days until Christmas. Daniel looked down at the wedding ring resting in his palm before quietly making a decision he could no longer avoid. Christmas Eve arrived with heavy snowfall covering the streets of Queens in white silence. Emily stood at the diner counter pouring coffee for the last few customers before closing while soft holiday music played through the old speakers overhead. Around her, people laughed about family dinners, exchanged gifts, and complained about crowded stores. Emily smiled politely whenever someone spoke to her, but deep inside, she only worried about making enough tips to buy something small for Sophie and Liam before morning. By the end of her shift, she counted the money inside her apron pocket twice. $31. It was not much, but maybe enough for a toy car for Liam and a sketchbook for Sophie from the discount store near the bus station. As she stepped outside into the freezing air, snowflakes drifted across the empty sidewalks beneath glowing Christmas lights. Her phone buzzed softly in her coat pocket. A text from Sophie. "Mom, do not rush home." Liam finally fell asleep. Emily smiled tiredly. Those children spent so much time trying not to burden her that it broke her heart. She pulled her coat tighter and began walking toward the bus stop when headlights suddenly slowed beside the curb. A black SUV stopped near her. Emily froze instinctively. The passenger window lowered slowly, revealing a familiar face she had not seen since the pawn shop. Daniel Brooks stepped out into the snow wearing a dark wool coat, while flakes settled quietly onto his shoulders. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily stared at him in confusion. "You?" Daniel gave a small nod. "Hi, Emily." Hearing her name from him made her chest tighten immediately. "How do you know my name?" Daniel looked down briefly before answering. "Can we talk?" Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away immediately. Another part already knew the truth before he said a single word. "It was you," she whispered softly. Daniel did not deny it. Snow drifted silently around them, while traffic moved slowly in the distance. Emily stared at him with tears already forming in her eyes. "The hospital bills, the groceries," Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Emily shook her head in disbelief. "Why?" Daniel reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out the wedding ring. The moment Emily saw it resting in his palm, her breath caught completely. "I should have returned this sooner," he said quietly. Emily stared at the ring like she was looking at a lost piece of her life. "I sold that." "I know." Daniel gently placed it into her trembling hand. "But I never could." Emily looked up at him, overwhelmed and confused all at once. "I do not understand any of this." Daniel glanced toward the snowy street before speaking again, his voice quieter now. "When I was a kid, my mother raised me alone. We were poor, really poor." Emily listened silently while clutching the ring tightly. "One winter she sold her wedding ring because we needed food and medicine." Daniel swallowed hard before continuing. "A few months later, she got sick. I was too young to help her, too young to save her." His eyes drifted toward the falling snow as old memories surfaced again. "After she died, I spent years trying to forget what it felt like watching somebody you love lose everything little by little." Emily's expression softened instantly. Daniel looked back at her. "Then you walked into that pawn shop asking for $12 like it was the most humiliating thing in the world." Emily lowered her eyes. "It was." Daniel shook his head gently. "No. What I saw was a mother doing whatever she had to do to keep her children safe." Emily felt tears finally slide down her cheeks. Nobody had said something kind to her like that in years. Daniel reached into his coat once more and handed her a small envelope. "There is also a job offer inside. One of my foundation offices needs someone managing community outreach programs." Emily blinked in shock. "Why would you trust me with something like that?" Daniel gave the faintest smile. "Because people who survive hardship usually understand others better than anyone else." Emily looked down at the ring resting in one hand and the envelope in the other, while snow continued falling quietly around them. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked completely dark. 1 year later, Emily Carter stood near the large windows of the Brooks Foundation Community Center watching fresh snow fall across the streets of Manhattan while families gathered inside for the annual Christmas dinner event. Children laughed near the decorated tree while volunteers carried trays of warm food through the crowded room. The sound of music and conversation filled the building with a kind of warmth Emily once thought only existed in other people's lives. "Mom, look what I made." Emily turned as Sophie ran toward her holding a handmade ornament covered in glitter and tiny silver stars. Emily smiled immediately. "That is beautiful." Sophie grinned proudly. At 11 years old, she looked happier now than Emily had seen in years. Her cheeks carried color again. Her laughter came easier. Across the room, Liam sat beside another group of children building gingerbread houses while wearing a small red sweater that Emily had bought him herself 2 weeks earlier. Every now And then he laughed so hard, he started coughing slightly out of habit before remembering his breathing no longer hurt the way it used to. The treatments had worked. The fear that once lived constantly inside Emily's chest had slowly begun fading month by month. Life was still not perfect. Bills still existed. Long days still happened. But survival no longer felt impossible. Every morning, she opened her eyes. Emily glanced down at the wedding ring resting once again on her finger. She did not wear it because of Jason anymore. In truth, she had not heard from him since the day he disappeared years earlier. Now the ring meant something entirely different. It reminded her of the moment she almost lost hope completely, and the stranger who reminded her she had not been invisible after all. "You look happier this year." Emily turned toward the familiar voice and saw Daniel approaching through the crowd, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her gently. "Thanks," she said softly. Daniel smiled as he watched Liam laughing across the room. He looked strong. Emily nodded. "He is doing really well now." For a moment, they simply stood together watching the families around them. It still amazed Emily sometimes how much life could change in a single year. After accepting the outreach position with Daniel's foundation, she discovered she was actually good at helping people. Maybe because she understood what desperation felt like. Every day she spoke with struggling mothers, families facing eviction, and parents terrified of medical bills. And every single time she helped someone breathe easier, even a little, she remembered exactly what it felt like standing in that pawn shop believing nobody cared. Daniel leaned quietly against the window beside her. "Rachel told me you stayed late 3 nights this week helping families finish paperwork." Emily laughed softly. "I guess I know how confusing that paperwork can feel." Daniel looked at her carefully for a moment before speaking again. "You changed this place more than you realize." Emily shook her head gently. "No, you changed my life." Daniel stared down into his coffee for a second before answering quietly. "Maybe, but you changed mine too." Emily looked at him in surprise. Daniel smiled faintly. "For a long time, I thought success meant escaping the life I grew up in. Expensive offices, fancy buildings, money." His eyes moved slowly across the crowded community center filled with children and families. Then one exhausted mother walked into a pawn shop asking for $12, and suddenly none of that felt important anymore. Emily felt tears fill her eyes again, but this time they came from gratitude instead of fear. Across the room, Sophie suddenly waved excitedly. "Mom, they are starting the Christmas countdown." Emily smiled and started walking toward the children before pausing briefly beside Daniel. "Merry Christmas," she whispered softly. Daniel nodded once. "Merry Christmas, Emily." As the countdown began and the room filled with cheering voices, Emily looked around at the warmth, the lights, the laughter, and the children smiling beside her. 1 year earlier, she had been terrified of losing everything. Now she finally understood something she never could have imagined during those cold nights of struggle. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness become the reason somebody survives long enough to believe in life again.